The Spinder-Myers Funeral Home and the Bakke Funeral Home and Crematory are proud sponsors of Our American Heritage.
Good morning and welcome to Our American Heritage. I am Arch Hunter, the host of the program. Our American Heritage is a program where we explore in depth the American experience from its beginning to the present. And today we want to welcome back as one of our very special guests, Rebecca Price Janney. Rebecca, welcome back to the program.
Hi, Arch. Thank you. It's great to talk with you again.
I think it's been almost a year since we had you on, and much has happened in your life in that year. So if you would briefly tell our listeners a little bit of your background, and we'll get right into your latest book.
Well, I've been very busy writing, and I've had my 23rd book published, and back in the summer had the wonderful honor of receiving 2 Golden Scroll Awards for historical fiction. So my book, Easton at the Crossroads, won first place, and the first book in my revival series, Morning Glory, won second place. And it was a wonderful event in Nashville, and I'm just very happy about that. It's always nice to have your writing recognized like that, to be affirmed.
Sure. And your background, Rebecca, is a little unique. So would you share with our listeners your educational background?
Sure. I'm a historian, and I am a theologically trained historian, which means that my undergraduate degree came from Lafayette College, and then my master's and doctoral degrees were from seminaries. So I have studied basically, my passion is American history, and have studied that from a theological, spiritual perspective, and have had the joy of writing a few cultural history books looking at how Americans' attitudes about things like the afterlife and marriage and family have evolved over the centuries.
Your latest book, Sweet, Sweet Spirit, give us a little bit of the background of, well, I'm going to throw you a curveball. At the beginning of your book, your dedication to the book. Is there a story behind your dedication that you would like to share or not?
Well, the book was prayed along by a lot of people, and I wanted to single out a few people and just give them a shout out for their support of the book. And part of it is that this is a book that is many years in the making. Often I get 6 months to a year to write a book, but this book has been in my heart in one way or another since I was 17 years old. And I won't tell you how long ago that was, but it was a long time ago. And
I'm going to guess, Rebecca, it's probably been only 20 years.
I knew I liked you. It's been a lot more than that. And it basically started when I became fascinated with the story of the late Senator Robert Kennedy. And not just his story, but the story of what was happening in 1968, which as a historian, I tend to see as one of the most troubled years in American history. And of course, Robert Kennedy was assassinated, and it happened just 2 months after Martin Luther King Jr. And when I became fascinated with him, he had been dead for several years, but I thought that his legacy shouldn't die. And in particular, I saw him as a champion of the downtrodden and oppressed and a uniter of people. And I saw him as somebody who was a man of faith and conviction. And so I started to write a nonfiction book dedicated to him so that my generation wouldn't forget who he was. But then I would say over the next 10 years, it became more personal. It became fiction instead of nonfiction. And I put it in the context of a young woman coming of age during that year, and how she pins all her hopes on him. And when he dies, she doesn't know where to look for hope. And so Sweet, Sweet Spirit is the story of her spiritual journey from that very rough year to the Asbury College revival of 1970. And her journey lasts about 2 years. Mine with this book lasted 30-some years.
Are you writing other books on American revivals? And are you going to be writing a series of books on American revivals?
Yes, actually, this is book 2 in a series that I'm writing for Elk Lake Publishing. And the series is called Morning in America. The first book, Morning Glory, takes place around 1740 in Philadelphia. And it's at the time when George Whitefield, the English evangelist, comes to America, and the Great Awakening really takes off after he comes. And we jumped ahead a couple of centuries to do Sweet, Sweet Spirit second, because this is the 50th anniversary of the Asbury College revival. So the third book in the series will actually be the second chronologically, and that will deal with the Second Great Awakening. So I'm planning to do a number of books. I'm not really sure how many yet, but I'll be dealing with some pretty big revivals that have happened throughout American history.
And what sparked your interest, Rebecca, in writing about revivals in American history?
I think it started about 1995. My husband is an Asbury graduate, and we had gone to Asbury for his college reunion, which just happened to coincide with the 25th anniversary of the 1970 revival. I had never heard of it before. And during some commemorative events, they showed a film called When God Comes, and it was basically the documentary story of what happened in February 1970 at Asbury. And I was just so taken with the story that it just gripped me. And I knew as a writer that I needed to do something with it. And over the years, I had written a couple of short stories about it in my nonfiction books, short accounts of what took place. But I knew it had to be something else. And that's when this whole idea began to come together of doing a series of historical novels about people who were caught up in various American revivals. So I would say that this exposure to the Asbury revival, my first exposure to it, led to all of this.
And if you would, please share with our listeners the story of the Asbury revival, because as I said, as you just said, a lot of people are not really familiar with it.
Correct. Asbury is in a small town in Wilmore, Kentucky, which is sort of a bedroom community of Lexington. And I like to compare it to Mayberry from the old Andy Griffith show. It's a very sleepy little southern town, and there's a college there. There's a seminary across the street. And in 1970, they had just passed through some difficult times, and they had gone through 4 college presidents in 2 years. And things were beginning to be more stable on the surface, but underneath there were problems. And there were people who weren't talking to each other. The student unrest that began over the Vietnam War on secular campuses was seeping in its own way into even Asbury, which is an independent Christian school. And even there were some kids who were experimenting with drugs and who were feeling somewhat rebellious against the administration. Nothing really overt, but again, under the surface. And some people began to pray for revival. And in February 1970, a revival broke out on campus.
And what did that look like? I mean, how did that transpire? How did that revival happen on campus?
Every week, there were, I believe, 3 chapel services that students were required to attend. And on Tuesday morning of February 3rd, 1970, the college dean was scheduled to preach. And he later told his son that nothing would come to him. He had all these, prayers, please, God, give me a message, and nothing came. And he walked onto the platform that morning in chapel, still not having a message. And he decided instead to give a testimony about what God was doing in his life. And when he finished, he invited some students. It was towards the close of chapel, but he asked if anybody would like to stand where they were and just give a little testimony of what God was doing in their lives. And throughout the chapel, students began to stand up and they started confessing things. And then a senior stood up and he began publicly confessing and repenting over his sins. And when he finished, students began rushing towards the front of the auditorium where there's an altar, and they began kneeling at the altar in prayer. And one professor said he remembered that there was such a rush to the altar that students were climbing over the seats to get down front. And there wasn't enough room at the altar for everybody. So students began kneeling where they were and confessing their sins and repenting. And the chapel service went past the appointed hour, and there were a couple people in the cafeteria, and they wondered why nobody was coming. And so they wandered over to Hughes Auditorium to find out what was going on, and the entire campus was still there. And this 1-hour chapel service turned into a service that lasted 188 hours.
Wow.
And
wow.
Yes, it was amazing. One student said he was sitting in the balcony when all of this broke, and there was a window behind him. And he said it was as if the window opened and he felt a breeze come through, and he knew it was the Holy Spirit. The president of the college had left very early that morning for some engagement in Canada, and the dean called him later that afternoon to tell him what was happening. And President Kinlaw said it was as if the glory of God filled the phone booth where he was. Wow. And he hurried back to campus, and when he arrived on campus and entered Hughes Auditorium, that same presence was there. And people said that even as they drove onto campus, this presence was there. And it quickly spread through the campus, across the street to the seminary, where revival broke out there. It broke out in the community where people began confessing and repenting. And then people from other colleges asked if students from Asbury could come and speak at their school about what was happening. And everywhere Asbury students went to share, the revival broke out there.
Wow.
And by
Powerful.
the end of the semester, it was very powerful. Dozens of colleges were affected, churches, secular schools, and by the end of that summer, the revival had spread to 5 continents. Truly an amazing outpouring
of the Spirit of God. Yes, just amazing, powerful, and I'm wondering why a lot of us have not heard a lot about the revival of 1970 for a lot of different reasons. 1970, Rebecca, is not that long ago for some of us. Do you see any similarities to 2020 where we are today? Is there anything common with 70?
Oh, absolutely. The unrest that the nation was going through at that time can still be felt today. It's manifesting itself a bit differently, but the political environment, the social media environment are both toxic. People's hearts have grown cold. There is great spiritual confusion. There's a lot of moral confusion. there's a sense in which the church needed to be revived back in 1970, and it needs to be revived today. So, yes, I do see a lot of similarities.
And so many of us, Rebecca, as believers, are constantly saying and praying that we truly need another revival in America. And we don't know how that's going to take place, but we certainly need that with what we see going on in our country today.
Oh, yeah.
What are some of the similar characteristics in revivals and when they transpire?
I think I'm seeing a pattern of a spiritual dry bones kind of climate, in the book of Ezekiel, in the valley of the dry bones, where God's people are spiritually dead. There's definitely that element. There's a sense in which there's a famine of God's word, that it's not being preached in its wholeness, or it's not being preached effectively. There's a sense of darkness where people will kind of fall for anything. They might not know what they need, but they know they need something. There's a reaching out. And I also think a characteristic that precedes revival, there are two things that I see. One is prayer, earnest prayer on the part of people who recognize what's happening. And the other thing is repentance. And I think in 2 Chronicles, it talks about, if my people who are called by my name will humble themselves and pray. It's not saying if unbelievers will just stop behaving badly, everything will get better. It's an appeal to God's people that we need to humble ourselves and pray. We need to confess our sins, and then God hears and he heals and he revives.
And so often we think as believers that revival is for the unbelievers. And what God is looking for is that revival in us, our hearts, as believers, to continue to influence the world.
What I see at Asbury is that God's people were revived. And through their revival, many came to Christ as a result of that. So it was both and. It was for God's people, with the result that their connection to him was strengthened and their witness was strengthened. And many, many came to faith in Christ as a result.
And we were talking last week, Rebecca, and I made the statement to you that you have written an amazing amount of books, and you write some of your books very quickly. And where can our listeners be able to purchase your books, first of all?
They can go to Amazon, of course, Barnes & Noble. And if they go to my website, RebeccaPriceJanney.com, there's a whole listing of the books that I've written over the years and links to buy them. So that might be the best place to start.
And our listeners, Rebecca also has a weekly podcast. Share with our listeners, please, where they can listen to your weekly podcast and the title for your podcast.
It's called Inspiring Stories from American History with Rebecca Price Janney, and it's on the major podcast platforms. I use Anchor.fm. It's also on Spotify, Apple, Google. The major podcasts carry it.
And listeners, Rebecca's stories on American history always have the very spiritual aspect of what's going on at the same time as we review it and we look at American history, which is extremely important for us to remember.
I think so. I like to look at God's fingerprints all over American history. I love to tell the stories of how he's worked in the past and to provide encouragement for today, because we're not the only ones who have lived in hard times, not by a long shot. And I think by looking at his activity in the past, we see a faithful God who never changes, who is constantly striving to restore us and revive us.
And you also are a very well-known speaker. Where could our listeners get a listing of where you are speaking in our area?
That's also on my website, RebeccaPriceJanney.com. I have a list of my speaking engagements that are coming up, and they can go there and check that out. And if they're interested in having me come and speak to their organization or church, they can also contact me through my website.
So, well, we are far from done talking to Rebecca about her latest book, Sweet, Sweet Spirit, and also other areas of her books and interests. So time has just flown by on this segment of our program, Rebecca. So we want to thank you for coming and sharing with us. And we're going to continue talking to Rebecca in our next program. So Rebecca, thank you so much for coming and sharing and for your writing and giving such a spiritual insight to American history along the way.
Oh, thank you, Arch. You are very welcome. It is a labor of love, believe me, and I so enjoy talking with you and look forward to the next segment.
Thank you so much. Listeners, this is 1180 AM WFYL, working for your liberty.
The Spender Myers Funeral Home and the Bakke Funeral Home and Crematory are proud sponsors of Our American Heritage.
When you experience the loss of a loved one, you can trust the Spender Myers Funeral Home and the Bakke Funeral Home and Crematory to guide you through the arrangements necessary to create a meaningful ceremony that celebrates the unique life being honored. Our staff is committed to providing your family with the highest quality of care and service in your time of need. We take pride in our responsibility to lighten your burden as you take the first step towards healing. Ask us about how we create a unique service for your loved one. Spender Myers Funeral Home and the Bakke Funeral Home and Crematory also helps with planning ahead so all the details of the service are taken care of. Ask us how we can connect you with grief support networks in your area. Spender Myers Funeral Home and the Bakke Funeral Home and Crematory has the resources to compassionately guide you through the loss of your loved one.
Contact us at 610-272-1941. That's 610-272-1941. Or visit our website at myersfh.com. That's MEYERSFH.com.
Good morning and welcome to Our American Heritage. I am Arch Hunter, the host of the program. American Heritage is a program where we explore the depth of American experience from the beginning to the present. And today we want to welcome as our guest Rebecca Price Janney. So Rebecca, welcome back to the program.
Hi, Arch. Thank you for having me back.
It's so good to hear you. We want to pick up on where we were talking the last time you were on, but in case our listeners did not hear, would you give them a little bit of your educational background and your background as an author?
Oh, sure. I am a theologically trained historian, and I specialize in early American history and 20th century American history. And let me see, my latest book, Sweet, Sweet Spirit, is my 23rd, and it's the second book in my Morning in America revival series.
And your latest book, Sweet, Sweet Spirit, we were talking about the background of it. So would you share with our listeners and then continue your thinking of the book and its background? And particularly, Rebecca, if you would talk about, you posted on Facebook this morning, I think something that's very appropriate for where we are right now.
Sure. Sweet, Sweet Spirit is one young woman's spiritual journey from the spring of 1968 to the Asbury College revival of February 1970. And the spring of 1968 was, in my opinion, one of the most convulsive times in American history. It was a time when we were in the Vietnam War and the Tet Offensive claimed many American lives. The protest movement against the war was very strong on college campuses and often turned violent. There was a lot of moral confusion in the country. It was a time of two political assassinations. So in April, Martin Luther King Jr. was killed. And then 2 months later, while on the campaign trail, Senator Robert F. Kennedy was killed. And the woman in my book, Melanie, has pinned all her hopes on Robert Kennedy. she believes he's the only one who can really hold the country together, and especially that he's the only one who can really bridge the gap between the races. And when he dies, she's devastated. She really doesn't know where to turn. And over the next 2 years, her journey takes her into an initial experience with the Christian faith, which is quickly doused when she goes to college, and a number of her professors are very much against the Christian faith. But then one of her best friends is at Asbury College as a freshman. And one evening in February, he calls her and he says that revival has broken out on the campus, and he believes very strongly that God wants her to be there. What I said in my Facebook post today was, I believe we're in a similarly convulsive time in our national history, and things are really stressful right now because of, I think, the response to the coronavirus and how a lot of people are panicked. And I invited them to read my book so that they would find out the source of Melanie's hope.
And you said that this is a series of books. Would the listeners be able to, read this book without having to read the book before it, or hopefully, and Lord willing, your books to follow?
That would be correct. Each book would be a standalone book. So the very first one was called Morning Glory, and it takes place all the way back in the 1700s with the First Great Awakening. And the rest of the books are supposed to be chronological, but the reason that my publisher and I went out of order with Sweet, Sweet Spirit was because we wanted the book to come out for the 50th anniversary of the Asbury College revival. And I think both of us felt pretty strongly that the book needed to be here for such a time as this. And as this year gets older, I begin to see the wisdom of that even more.
I know for you personally, over the past several months, there's been chaos in your life or pressure in life because your husband has taken a new job, you have moved, and you have to set up a new house. How are you able to continue to write these books with that going on in your life, and as well as your very busy speaking schedule and your podcasts?
The writing itself brings me such joy, and it's really an emotional release for me. In some ways, it's almost an escape from reality because when I'm spending time with my fictional characters, I get to decide pretty much what they do and when they do it. So it's not just an escape, but it's a way for me to control circumstances, if you will. And of course, I am writing about something that really happened. So I'm not just making it all up. There's an awful lot in here that is true. And the events I'm describing are all true. But I think you know what I mean by I can tell Melanie what to do and she does it. So I definitely have to be organized and disciplined. And I know I've heard some people say, oh, do you just write when you're inspired? And gosh, if I did that, I would never get anything done. It really is something that you have to sit down and put your mind to and just get it done.
With your 23 books, Rebecca, talk to our listeners about what's the process of research that you have to do to be able to put in print exactly what you want to say.
I think that for me as a historian, research comes pretty naturally to me. It's something that I've learned, a skill I've learned over the years since I was in college. And I have a variety of methods of research. I love to use primary sources whenever possible. I read books, journals, I interview people. Obviously, I couldn't interview George Whitefield because he's been dead for about 300 years, but I interview people whenever I can. So it's a matter of going to historical libraries, researching out of my own library at home. The internet is wonderful. And I've met some really interesting people along the way, people who have done amazing things or have been part of amazing things. For example, with Sweet, Sweet Spirit, I got to talk to a lot of people who were at Asbury during the revival. And they have been among the most fun people I think I've ever talked to in my life for a writing project. And that would include the Philadelphia Phillies. As you know, Arch, I covered the Phillies as a teenager for my local newspaper. But even as thrilling as that was, it didn't quite compare to the people I met through this Asbury experience.
With your 23 books, how many of your books are historical fiction and how many of them are just straight American history? Because I know you have some that are just straight American history, and your podcasts are just American history.
Right. So I have another series called the Easton series, and that's 3 books. That's historical fiction, but there are 2 main characters, one who's historical, the other one who is contemporary, and their lives parallel in a lot of ways. So I have those 3 books. I have the 2 now in the series with the revival, so that would be 5. And the rest of the books, aside from 11 that I did initially that were young adult books, one was a mystery series of 8. The other 3 were fiction, and they were based on historical mysteries. So let me see. I think we're up to about 8 that are fictional, and the rest is nonfiction.
And Rebecca, what was your decision to write historical fiction?
I think the decision found me. I started to research my family history about 10 years or so ago. And what I uncovered was so life-changing for me. And some of the people I met, quote unquote, through my research moved me so much that I felt compelled to write about them. And one in particular, who is the other main character in my Easton series. And so for me, it's a matter of casting my bread upon the waters. I pitch the idea to my agent. My agent starts pitching the idea to various publishers. And that's where the rub is. And that's where I really discern whether or not God has called me to write what I'm doing. And Elk Lake Publishing caught the vision of my being a historian, writing historical fiction, and it's been a great experience. It really is exercising a different side of my brain, I think, and helping me become more artistic and creative. I've loved it.
And, you know, we as historians, we have these conversations oftentimes with people about writing just straight historic about history or historical fiction. And oftentimes, you know, so many people quote killer angels and gods and generals, and that's historical fiction. And yet the history in it is accurate. And so it's to our listeners, it's worthwhile reading. And particularly with Rebecca, I have full confidence because I've read several of your books that the history is accurate. And your research is so thorough in reading, and your books are so easy to read. And I don't mean that critically. I mean that as a compliment to our listeners.
Thank you.
So we have to understand that listeners, Rebecca does a tremendous amount of research. So when she writes about the history of a story, the history is accurate, and which is very important for people to understand. So
yes. I had an experience when I was at Asbury last month for the 50th anniversary, and I spoke a couple of times during the commemorative celebration, and one of the questions I've been asked was about a certain scene that happened in Sweet, Sweet Spirit, and was that scene real? Did it actually happen? And that one scene was one of my favorites in the book, where Melanie is going with her friends back to her home church, to tell the story of what was going on at Asbury with the revival. And they go into a rather questionable sort of diner restaurant in a really out of the way town. And they don't feel very comfortable there. And some people start talking to them, and gradually they start talking about the Asbury revival. And before you know it, revival breaks out in that restaurant. Totally unexpected. And although that scene is fictional, it's based on a number of accounts that I read from actual Asbury students who had similar things happen to them when they went out and started to tell the story.
Wow.
So that's an example of where I can get really creative, but still, even when I'm doing that, base it on what actually took place.
And do you have give us a sneak piece of possibly what you're thinking about, or are you in the process of writing your next book?
I am just starting to think about it. I'm starting to go around in my mind about possible characters. I do know that it will be during the Second Great Awakening, and one of the central historical figures, if not the main historical figure, would be Charles Finney, because of his key position in the Second Great Awakening. So I'm looking at the late 1830s at this point.
Okay, so listeners, that's possibly a sneak preview of possibly what we're going to have coming from Rebecca. Would you tell our listeners, because your podcasts that are they're what, about 5 or 6 or 7 minutes long that you do your podcasts?
Yes, I do try to keep them around that length. I've had a couple in the last month or so that have been longer, and I wanted to keep to my usual format, but there was just so much to share. For instance, the one I did this week was on Harriet Beecher Stowe, and it was the story of how she was inspired to write Uncle Tom's Cabin, and then I didn't feel I could tell that particular part of the story without talking about the impact that book had. So in cases like that, they run to more like 10 or 15 minutes.
Okay. And where would our listeners be able to listen to your podcast?
My platform is anchor.fm, but Anchor has a relationship with a lot of other podcasting platforms. So I know it's available on Stitcher and the Apple Podcasts. And, oh gosh, there's a whole list. So if you just look up my name and Inspiring Stories from American History, you'll find it.
And listeners, they truly are inspiring stories, because Rebecca, which oftentimes we as believers forget, that history is going on, but there's a whole spiritual battle going on. And Rebecca constantly is bringing that out in her podcast, that we are not in control. God is. And it's always an underlying theme in all of your podcasts, where you're just not only very informational, but very rewarding and comforting to hear that, Rebecca, in your podcast. So thank you for that.
Well, thank you, Arch. And I think another thing I try to bring out is that even though things may seem out of control at times, they're not. God is in control. And he's not only in control, but he's using what's happening for his purposes. So the governor might say, don't go to Costco, or don't go to church, or whatever. I don't know if he said don't go to church. I'm just saying that. But,
not yet.
Avoid gatherings. They could be. But, don't run out of toilet paper and toothpaste. But the fact is that God is not surprised by this. And I believe, because I've seen from history how he's worked in the past, that he's working in all of this today. And that ultimately we don't really have anything to fear, because he'll take care of us.
Yes. And so we so quickly forget that as we see what's going on around us. Another question,
it's easy
Rebecca,
to lose sight of it.
Oh, we lose sight of it. We're no different than the children of Israel out in the wilderness.
Absolutely.
Your books, or particularly Sweet, Sweet Spirit, about how long does it take, or did it take for you to write that particular book?
Well, it depends on what you mean by how long. The inspirational part of it, the part of creating it, was the process that actually happened over decades. In one way or another, I worked on this book from the time I was a teenager until it came out. So this is a little unusual for me, but this book has been in one way, shape, or form in my heart for a long time. As far as actually writing it goes, I would say that the book that you had in your hand when you read it was probably about the 10th time that I actually wrote it.
That's interesting.
And most of the time, I write a book in 6 months to a year, but this one was unusual.
And you mentioned that since you were a teenager, you were an author or a writer in your teenage years. Did you always want to be a writer or a journalist?
Not always. I wanted to be an astronaut. That's pretty much the reaction I got from my principal. Yeah, I remember sitting in her office in 8th grade, and she's taking notes and looking at my records and trying to figure out the best course of study for me in high school. And she asks me, "What do you want to do?" And I say, "Be an astronaut." And I kind of left there with my tail between my legs because it was pretty apparent that I was not the right stuff. But she told me that she saw in me a real strength of writing, and she wondered if I had ever considered that. And at that point, I started praying if maybe that was the way that I was to take. And I started winning a lot of writing contests, and those were my confirmation. So I would say from about the time I was 13 or 14 that I knew that this was what I wanted to do. And the neat thing, Arch, is that one of my very first really big interviews was with an Apollo astronaut.
Wow.
And I figured if I couldn't be an astronaut, I could at least interview one.
Is that possibly, Rebecca, maybe a book in the future?
Oh, I'm not sure. Although I have worked on a book, my agent is trying to find a publisher for it, and it's called Diamond Girl. And it's about the couple of years when I was a teenager that I was covering the Phillies in Major League Baseball.
Well, that's interesting. We're sorry, or I'm sorry, but not really sorry, that you didn't become an astronaut, because your writing and your books and your podcasts and your speaking has educated a lot of us and a lot of not only American history, but a constant reminder that our eyes are to be focused on Jesus, not on the circumstances all around us. So NASA's loss, Rebecca, is really our gain. So listeners, thank you. You were doing far more for a lot of people in our country that are reading your books and listening to your podcast to constantly remind us where our focus should be. Share with our listeners, please, where they're able to purchase your books and your website so they could read more about you and your upcoming speaking events.
Sure. My website is RebeccaPriceJanney.com. That's Janney. And on my website, I have a link to all the books that I've written, and I believe that my webmaster has links there to Amazon, because especially now, with a lot of stores being shut down, Amazon is really the easiest way to get them. And I also have a link on the website regarding my upcoming speaking engagements. Unfortunately, one this month, towards the end of the month, was postponed until next year. So I'm hoping that the ones from April on might be able to take place as scheduled. But I'm also extremely grateful that the launch of my book, the big part of it, happened last month, and that I didn't miss anything.
And you do a lot of work for the Daughters of the American Revolution.
I am a member, yes.
you're a member. Are your meetings open to people that want to be involved, or how could someone become a member of the Daughters of the American Revolution?
You have to prove your lineal descent from a patriot. And a patriot could be obviously someone who fought in a battle, someone who served politically during the Revolution, who paid a supply tax. There are women who are patriots, who have been proven as patriots because of the various ways that they served during the Revolution. And I was able to prove my descent from a patriot, and I filled out all the paperwork and joined. And it's a wonderful service-oriented organization. And I'm really glad to be able to continue voluntarily a lot of the work that my ancestors began all those centuries ago.
You are a very, very busy person. You're a wife, a mother, an author, a speaker. It just goes on and on and on. So thank you so much for taking time to talk to us. Listeners, I highly recommend Sweet, Sweet Spirit to you. It will not only captivate you, it will encourage you in your faith to continue to keep our eyes on Jesus. So, Rebecca, thank you so much for sharing with us today, and bless you as you continue to minister and write for all of us. So thank you so much for coming.
Oh, it's my pleasure, Arch. I always love being on your show, and God bless you too.
Oh, God bless you. This is WFYL 1180, working for your liberty.
The Spender Myers Funeral Home and the Bakke Funeral Home and Crematory are proud sponsors of Our American Heritage.